The Vietnam War. It's a name that just echoes through history, right? It was a conflict that didn't just define a generation, it completely changed how the world saw a superpower. So how did a mission that seemed so clear-cut spiral into one of the most complicated and divisive wars we've ever seen?
Wow. This quote, it just perfectly sums up the whole tragic story. A war that America walked into with so much confidence and walked away from with a real crisis of identity. Let's dig into how that all went down. Okay, so to really get why this war was such a disaster for the US, we have to go right back to the beginning. See, long before American boots were on the ground, this was a conflict that started with a country literally torn in half.
And the division couldn't have been more clear. In the north, you had a communist government with the backing of the Soviet Union and China. And in the south, an anti-communist government. This split Vietnam right down the middle and turned it into a major battleground in the much bigger Cold War.
This is where America steps in. They were driven by what was called the domino theory, this idea that if Vietnam fell to communism, all the neighboring countries would just topple over, one by one. So the United States threw all of its incredible military and economic power behind South Vietnam. The goal was simple: stop communism.
But here's the thing. The American military, this was a conventional powerhouse, right? Built for these huge, epic battles. But they quickly realized they were in a totally different kind of war. They were trying to fight an enemy they could barely even see, an enemy that would just vanish into thin air. The guerrilla fighters, known as the Viet Cong, they didn't meet you on a battlefield. The battlefield was them. They used the dense jungle like a shield, laying these devastating booby traps and perfecting lightning-fast hit-and-run ambushes. They had massive networks of underground tunnels so they could pop up, strike, and disappear before American soldiers even knew what hit them. So you have America's B-52 bombers, its tanks, all this overwhelming firepower, and a lot of the time it was totally useless against this enemy that was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It was a 20th century army that just couldn't figure out the rules of this new game.
But the fight wasn't just happening in the jungles of Vietnam. Another front was opening up, and this one was maybe even more important. It was happening thousands of miles away, right in America's living rooms.
So, while the military was getting bogged down on the ground, the American public was being told, don't worry, victory is right around the corner. What was it that completely shattered that story? What turned everyone against the war?
Well, the answer was the television. For the first time in history, the raw, ugly reality of war was being beamed directly into people's homes every single night. You had people watching images of villages on fire, seeing civilian casualties, and looking at the exhausted, totally frustrated faces of their own young soldiers. This wasn't some far-off conflict anymore. It was right there on the evening news.
And the effect was immense. The gap between what the government was telling people and what they were seeing with their own eyes just got wider and wider until you couldn't bridge it. Support for the war didn't just dwindle, it completely collapsed. This led to huge protests and a country that was deeply, deeply divided. With the support at home just gone, and the situation in Vietnam getting worse, the end of America's part in the war was pretty much a done deal. And that final chapter, it happened fast.
And yeah, the end came quickly. In 1973, the last of the American combat troops pulled out. Just 2 years later, in April 1975, North Vietnamese forces rolled in and captured the southern capital, Saigon. The war was over, and Vietnam was now a unified, communist country, the very thing the U.S. had spent years fighting to prevent.
For a country that saw itself as a global defender of freedom, a nation that came out victorious from 2 world wars, this was a massive, humbling blow. It was, without a doubt, the biggest military defeat in its history.
So, all these years later, what's the big takeaway from this whole devastating conflict? Well, it's more than just a story about a military loss. It's a really profound lesson about war itself.
When you boil it all down, the war showed us a really powerful truth. America for sure had the technology, it had the money, it had all the firepower. But the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, they had something that turned out to be even more powerful. This incredibly strong, unified determination to win the war on their own land, on their own terms.
And so, the Vietnam War left America, and the whole world really, with this tough, lingering question. What are the true limits of military power? It's a question that feels just as important today as it did when those last helicopters were lifting off the embassy roof in Saigon.